The station was dying. Not quickly, not cleanly. It was dying the way empires die, in increments, in silence, in the space between one breath and the next. Forward Array Vanguard 7 hung at the edge of the Corvin Rift like a rusted nail holding together the last shred of humanity's deep space presence. And Commander David Okafor had exactly 11 minutes to figure out why an alien warship the size of a small moon had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel and parked itself 40 kilometers off his port bow. Before we see how humanity answered that silence, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The warship was Tharessi. He knew that from the silhouette alone, for sweeping energy veins, a hull of living crystalline alloy that pulsed with interior light, a vessel so advanced that the Interstellar Sovereignty Compact had classified it a Class 7 existential contact event. He'd read the briefings. He'd run the drills. None of it had prepared him for the sheer weight of the thing sitting there, watching, waiting. The comms crackled. Not a message, not a demand. A single question, translated in real time by the station's linguistic bridge. A technology that Tharessi engineers had gifted to humanity 30 years ago as a gesture of what they called conditional goodwill. The voice that came through was low, resonant, and carried something David couldn't immediately identify. Not hostility. Something more complicated than that. Commander Okafor, are you alone? He looked around the command deck. 12 crew members stared back at him, hands poised over stations, faces unreadable. 12 people who had signed up for deep space duty knowing the odds. 12 people who deserved better than to die for a protocol he didn't yet understand. He straightened his collar, cleared his throat, and keyed the transmitter. Depends on what you mean by alone, General, because the intelligence had identified her rank. General Seva Marin of the Tharessi 7th Reconquest Fleet. Which raised a question David hadn't stopped turning over since the moment her ship appeared. What, exactly, was the 7th Reconquest Fleet reconquering? And why, in all the vastness of known space, had they come here? Her ship didn't move, didn't arm weapons, didn't hail again. 3 minutes passed, then 5. David watched the long-range sensors for any sign of additional vessels. There were none. A Tharessi fleet general, alone, in a single ship, at the edge of humanity's frontier, asking if he was alone. The tactical calculus was impossible. This wasn't an invasion posture. This wasn't a diplomatic approach either. This was something in between. Something David had no manual for. Then the docking request came through. Not a forced approach vector. Not a weapons lock. A formal, courteous, and unmistakably urgent docking request. The kind you submitted when you were out of options and had chosen to trust someone you had no particular reason to trust. David Okafor had 12 people to protect, a station running on 30% power, and an alien general asking for permission to come aboard. He approved the request. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that somewhere behind Seva Marin's ship, moving through the dark without engines or heat signatures, or any trace that conventional sensors could catch, something else was following her. And it was hungry. The docking clamp sealed with a resonant clang that shook the deck plates, and David Okafor went to meet the enemy at the airlock. He didn't think of her as the enemy, but his hand stayed close to the sidearm at his hip, and the 2 security officers flanking him had their rifles at low ready, and everyone on that side of the station understood that courtesy and caution were not mutually exclusive. The inner airlock cycled. The pressure equalized. The door slid open. General Seva Marin was not what the intelligence files had described. The files had listed her as 6 feet 2 inches, crystalline-plated, combat-augmented, command-ranked, and all of that was accurate in the same way a weather report was accurate and still left you unprepared for standing in the storm. She was tall and precise and wore armor that moved with her like a second skin, and her eyes, 4 of them, arranged in a vertical line down the center of her face, were the deep amber of a dying star. But the files had not mentioned that she would be bleeding. Not from a wound David could see. The bleeding was in the way she moved, in the particular tension of someone carrying something far heavier than their armor. She stopped 3 feet from him and did not reach for a weapon. "Commander!" Her voice through the translation matrix was clear and measured. "I need your help." The sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. David felt the ripple of it move through his crew. Tharessi didn't ask humans for help. Tharessi provided help, conditionally, at arm's length, from the comfortable altitude of a civilization that had achieved faster-than-light travel when humanity was still debating whether the Earth was round. The dynamic between their species had been polite, distant, and profoundly unequal for 3 decades. And now the 7th most decorated military commander in Tharessi history was standing in David's airlock asking for assistance. He said the only reasonable thing. "You'd better come in." He took her to the station's briefing room, which was generous nomenclature for a space with a table, 6 chairs, and a wall screen that flickered on its left side if the humidity rose above 40%. She sat across from him. Her 4 eyes tracked everything in the room. The exits, the equipment, the faces of the 2 officers he'd kept with him, with the efficiency of someone who had spent her life calculating threat vectors. He pushed a container of water toward her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. "I'll speak plainly," she said. "My fleet was destroyed 11 days ago. Not defeated. Destroyed. 47 vessels reduced to debris in less than 4 hours. Her voice did not waver. "We encountered an entity we have no record of. No clasification. No tactical file. It does not communicate. It does not negotiate. It does not respond to any form of energy weapon we possess." She paused. "It does not respond to anything we possess." David kept his voice even. "What does respond to it?" The question seemed to surprise her. She had expected fear, perhaps, or disbelief, not immediate tactical thinking. Something shifted in her expression. So briefly he almost missed it. "I don't know," she said. "That is why I am here." She had come to the edge of humanity's frontier, alone in a single ship, to find the one species in the known galaxy that still built things with their hands, that still manufactured weapons from metal and chemistry and the brute physics of objects colliding at speed, that had never fully abandoned the old methods, not because they hadn't mastered the new ones, but because, and here David felt a quiet, strange pride, humans never trusted the universe enough to put all their eggs in one elegant basket. He leaned forward. "Tell me everything about what you're fighting." She did. And somewhere in the dark outside the station's hull, moving without heat or light, the thing she had described was still following her trail. Exactly as it had followed her fleet. Exactly as it had followed every Tharessi vessel that had tried to run. It was patient. It always was. The felt moved through space the way grief moved through people, without announcement, without mercy, and entirely immune to the defenses you had built against everything else. That was what Seva Marin called them. The felt. A Tharessi word that translated, imperfectly, as the hollow that remains. They were not ships. They were not creatures in any biological sense she had been able to determine. They were disruptions. Organized, purposeful, devastatingly targeted disruptions, entities that existed in the seam between energy states, that fed on coherent field emissions, that experienced every form of directed energy as something closer to nutrition than threat. Plasma cannons fed them. Particle arrays fed them. The quantum resonance weapons that formed the backbone of Tharessi military doctrine, the most sophisticated destructive technology in the explored galaxy, fed them. David listened to all of this without interruption, his hands flat on the table, his face very still. "How large are they?" he asked when she finished. "The smallest we observed was approximately 3 meters across. The largest," she stopped, "the largest was the size of your station." "How do they kill?" "Systematic field disruption." They collapse the energy systems of a vessel in sequence. Life support first, then propulsion, then a pause that carried weight, then everything else. 47 ships. David did the math without wanting to. Tens of thousands of personnel. Gone in 4 hours. Your weapons didn't touch them, he said. Not even slow them down? Nothing we directed at them produced any measurable effect. She held his gaze with all 4 of her eyes. Our science division theorized, in the hours before they were destroyed, that the felt exist in a partial phase state, present in physical space but not fully anchored to it. Energy weapons pass through the seam. They dissipate before impact. She leaned forward slightly. But matter does not. Physical matter, traveling at sufficient velocity, forced below the phase threshold by kinetic momentum, theoretically it should interact. She let the sentence breathe. David looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the equipment locker mounted on the wall behind him, entered his authorization code, and removed his sidearm from the rack. He checked the chamber, confirmed the load, solid copper-jacketed rounds, standard station security issue, and set it on the table in front of her. "Pick it up," he said. She did, carefully, turning it over in her hands with the focused attention of someone encountering a genuinely foreign object. Her fingers found the grip with instinctive logic, the geometry of a thing designed to be held translated across species lines more easily than most things. 300 years ago by our calendar, David said. This was state-of-the-art military technology. We've built things that make it look like a toy, but we kept making it. We kept improving it. We never stopped. He watched her examine the weapon. Because the universe has a way of presenting problems that sophisticated answers can't solve. And sometimes the right answer is mass times velocity, applied with precision. Something moved in her expression again. Longer this time. He catalogued it without analyzing it. "You have these weapons in quantity," she said. It was not quite a question. "We have them in abundance," he said. "And if your theory is right, if the felt interact with physical matter the way they interact with energy, then we have something your fleet didn't. We have a reason to go back." The station's proximity alarm went off. Not a drill. Not a sensor ghost. The long-range array had detected a signature. Formless, sourceless, present where nothing had been a moment before. And every light on the command deck had shifted from white to red. The felt had found them. David grabbed the sidearm off the table and headed for the command deck at a run. Behind him, Seva Marin rose from her chair with the fluid speed of a warrior who had already been preparing for exactly this moment. She had led them here. She knew it. He knew it. But what neither of them knew yet was that the felt hadn't followed Seva Marin at all. They had followed something else entirely. There were 3 of them. The sensors resolved the signatures one by one. Formless blooms of displaced space, each roughly 4 meters across, drifting toward the station on a vector that made no mechanical sense. They did not decelerate. They did not adjust for the station's rotation. They simply moved, the way purpose moved, steadily and without hesitation. David had 40 seconds to do something unprecedented in human Tharessi relations.
And the Seva Marena rifle.
Not a plasma emitter. Not a field disruptor. An HK pattern military carbine, 7.62 millimeters, with a 30-round magazine and a targeting scope that had been manufactured in a facility outside of Hartford, Connecticut, by workers who went home to their families every evening and had no idea their product would one day be the last line of defense at the edge of known space. He loaded it himself, hands moving from muscle memory, and passed it to her stock first. She took it without hesitation. "How do I operate it?" she asked. "Point it at the thing you want to stop. Pull the trigger. The loud part is normal." He grabbed his own weapon from the rack. "Stay close to me." The station had 3 external airlocks. The felt were approaching all 3 simultaneously. David split his crew, 2 officers to each corridor, himself and Seva Marin holding the central junction, the only choke point that covered all 3 approach vectors. The emergency lights cast everything in deep red. The hum of the station's power systems, the sound that had been constant background for 18 months, faltered. Once, twice. They were feeding already. The first felt came through the port airlock the way water came through a crack. Not by force but by inevitability. It passed through the airlock door as if the door were suggestion rather than structure, and for a moment it simply hovered there in the corridor, a sphere of displaced reality approximately the size of a large dog, its surface shimmering with the kind of light that made the eyes hurt to hold. Seva Marin raised the rifle. David put a hand on her arm. Wait for it to move. It moved. He fired first. 3 rounds, center mass, from 12 meters. The effect was not what he had hoped for and not what he had feared. The rounds did not pass through. They hit. The felt reacted. A full body contraction. A sudden spike of light from its surface. A sound that existed below the threshold of hearing but vibrated through the deck plates like a struck bell. Pulled back toward the wall. It did not disperse. But it stopped advancing. It felt that, Seva Marin said very quietly. It felt that, David confirmed. Keep firing. She fired. Not in panic, not in spray, in careful, measured bursts, adapting to the recoil after the first round with a speed that told him she had been in combat before, that the mechanics of aiming and squeezing and compensating were already transferring across the gap between their biologies. Each round hit. Each round produced that contraction, that spike of light, that withdrawal. By the 8th round, the felt in the corridor was smaller. Visibly, measurably smaller. In the other 2 corridors, his officers were learning the same lesson under fire, and the station shook with the percussion of kinetic weapons doing exactly what they had been built to do, transferring force into matter, demanding that the laws of physics apply, refusing to accept that anything in the universe got to opt out of Newton. The cost came on the 9th minute. Ensign James Reyes, 23 years old, from Queens, New York, was standing at the junction to the secondary corridor when the largest of the 3 felt, the one that had been moving slowest, that they'd been watching least, surged forward in a burst of acceleration that none of the sensors had predicted. It didn't reach him. David put 8 rounds into it from across the room and it contracted and withdrew. But the energy disruption it had already generated was enough. James went down, his suit's power systems failed, and he did not get up. The felt retreated. All 3 of them. Back through the walls. Back into the dark. The station fell silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant, weakened hum of the power grid fighting to stabilize. Seva Marin lowered the rifle. She looked at the place where James Reyes had fallen, and for a long time she did not look anywhere else. Then she looked at David. We drove them back, she said. We drove them back, David confirmed. His voice was flat. Not because he didn't feel it, because he felt it completely and had learned a long time ago that this was how you kept going. And now we know it works. He reloaded. Which means we can take the fight to them. She studied his face in a way that no one had studied his face in a very long time. You lost someone, she said. You are not stopping. No, he said. Stopping is how you lose everyone else. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something in Tharessi, not routed through the translation matrix, something she chose to say in her own language, probably knowing he couldn't understand it. He asked her later what it meant. She told him it was a phrase her people used for commanders who chose to stand when standing was the harder thing. Translated, roughly, as, someone worth following. He didn't know that yet, but the way she looked at him when she said it, he would remember that look. Long after everything else that followed, he would remember it. 12 hours after the attack, Vanguard 7 was a different station. Not repaired. Not restored. Different. In the particular way that places become different after violence has moved through them and left its mark in the walls and the silences and the faces of the people still standing. David had filed his incident report, overseen the medical assessment of his crew, and personally written the message to James Reyes's family in Queens. He had done that last part alone in the dark, and he had taken exactly as long as it needed to take, and then he had stood up and walked back to work. Seva Marin found him in the armory. She had slept for 4 hours. He knew because he'd had the crew track her biosigns out of what he told himself was reasonable security protocol. She had accepted the offered quarters without comment, and she had slept, And now she stood in the armory doorway watching him inventory ammunition crates with an expression he was beginning to learn to read. Not the tactical calculation he'd seen in the airlock. Something more personal. "You keep very careful records of your weapons," she said. "We keep careful records of everything." He set down the manifest. "It's a human thing. We document our failures so we can stop repeating them. We document our weapons so we know what we have left." He paused. "We document our dead so they're not forgotten." She was quiet. Then she came and stood beside him at the nearest rack, looking at the rifles arranged there with that same focused attention she'd given the weapon during the fight. Not admiration, exactly. Something closer to recognition. "My fleet," she said. "I filed the incident report before I ran. Standard Tharessi protocol, you file the record before you retreat, so that the record survives even if you don't." She touched the stock of one of the rifles without lifting it. The response from High Command arrived 6 hours later. "They are assembling a response force. 40 vessels. They estimate they will be ready in 3 months." A pause that said everything. The Felt have been accelerating their movement pattern. 3 months is not 3 months. David turned to face her fully. "What's the actual timeline?" 6 weeks. Perhaps 7. After that, the Felt will have reached the Tharessi inner systems. She met his gaze with all 4 eyes. 112 inhabited worlds. 11 billion people. The number sat in the air between them. David Okafor had grown up in Lagos, Nigeria, on a planet of 8 billion people. He understood large numbers not as abstractions but as weight, as the specific, particular mass of the lives that composed them. 11 billion people. He let himself feel the full meaning of that for exactly the 3 seconds it required. Then he set it down somewhere he could carry it. "We can arm your remaining vessels," he said. "Retrofit kinetic weapons systems. It's not elegant. The recoil loads alone will require structural reinforcement on your hull frames. Tharessi ships aren't built for it." He was already calculating. "But it can be done. And I know people. Earth has manufacturing infrastructure that can be mobilized." He crossed the armory to the far wall, where the station's secure communication terminal was mounted. "I need to make some calls." She followed him, stopped 2 feet away, close enough that he became aware, not for the first time but more acutely than before, of the particular quality of her presence. There was a warmth that the Tharessi crystalline plating seemed to conduct rather than block, and the amber of her eyes at this range had depth in it, layers he hadn't noticed from across a table. "Commander!" Her voice had changed register, still measured, but underneath the measurement something else. "David." It was the first time she had used his given name. He turned to look at her. "You filed a report," she said. "After losing someone, and then you came here to find a way to save people you have never met." She paused. "I have commanded fleets for 19 years. I have served under 6 different admirals. I have never—" She stopped. Started again. "The Tharessi do not ask for help. We were taught from the first day of command training that asking for help was an admission of failure. That self-sufficiency was the highest virtue." Her voice was very quiet now. "I was wrong. I came here because I was out of options. I stayed because you showed me that there is something stronger than self-sufficiency." She held his gaze. "You showed me what it looks like when someone chooses not to stop." The communication terminal waited. 6 weeks. 11 billion lives. Every second counted. He didn't move for a long moment. "I'll make my calls," he said finally. "And then I'd like to talk to you. Not about tactics." He held her gaze. "Just talk." Something happened in her expression. Something that the intelligence files would not have been able to classify because it wasn't tactical at all. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." He keyed the terminal. The channel opened. And across the station, in the armory where the rifles stood in their racks and the brass casings from the night's defense sat in a collection tray on the floor, the weight of everything that was coming was held, for just a moment, by something that had nothing to do with war. Humanity was about to enter the most critical military engagement in its history. But first, David Okafor called home. And standing beside him, General Seva Marin of the Tharessi 7th Fleet heard, for the first time, what it sounded like when one human being called another to say, "We are not done yet. We are still here. We are still fighting." She had not cried in 19 years of command. She did not cry now, but her bioluminescent indicators, the faint golden threads of light that ran beneath Tharessi's skin and responded to emotion in ways their owners could not fully suppress, glowed very briefly, brighter than they had since the night her fleet burned. Outside the station, in the dark of the Corvin Rift, the Felt were moving again. They were not the only ones. The fleet arrived on the 38th day. Not 40 vessels. Not the measured, careful response that Tharessi High Command had authorized. 41 Tharessi warships, each one retrofitted with kinetic weapon systems that the engineers of both species had worked without sleep to install. Each one crewed by soldiers who had watched their comrades die to something they couldn't fight and were about to discover what it felt like to fight back. And alongside them, in a formation that had never existed before in the history of either civilization, 11 human vessels, destroyers and frigates from the Terran Expeditionary Force, their holds loaded with enough ammunition to sustain 12 hours of continuous fire. 12 hours. It would have to be enough. David Okafor stood on the command deck of Vanguard 7, which had been reclassified as a forward tactical station for the engagement, and watched the combined fleet arrange itself across his screens. Seva Marin stood beside him. She had not returned to her ship. She had remained on the station for all 38 days, working alongside his crew, eating in the mess hall, learning the sound of a place that ran on human rhythms, on coffee and shift changes and the peculiar comfort of people who called each other by first names and argued about small things because they trusted each other enough to argue. She had talked to him. Not about tactics. He had talked to her. Not about tactics. He understood now what she had said in Tharessi on the night of the attack. She had told him before the translation matrix could render it, because some things you say first in your own language, someone worth following. He understood it not as a military assessment but as something far more specific and far more personal, and on the morning of the 37th day, in the corridor outside the armory, he had said as much to her, and she had looked at him for a long time with all four of her eyes before she said, very quietly, that the Tharessi had a word for what happened when two people from different worlds discovered they were, in some essential way, the same world. She had not told him the word yet. She had said she would tell him after. The Felt arrived on schedule, or rather, they did not arrive because they had always been there, moving through the dark at the pace of inevitability, and the fleet simply caught up to them. The sensors resolved them. 63 individual signatures, each between 4 and 12 meters across, arranged in the loose dispersed pattern that Seva had described from the destruction of her fleet. They were not a formation. They did not operate by strategy. They operated by appetite. And until 38 days ago, that had been enough. David keyed the fleet-wide channel. All ships, this is Commander Okafor. You know what these things did to the 7th Fleet. You know what they took from us. He paused. They don't know what we've built. They don't know what we brought. And in about 30 seconds, they're going to find out that the universe has a rule they forgot to account for. His voice was steady. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Let's remind them. The first volley came from the human destroyers, rail-accelerated tungsten darts moving at a fraction of light speed, a wall of kinetic force that hit the leading Felt before they could register the threat. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The struck entities convulsed, collapsed inward, shrank from their dispersed phase state into something solid and present and, for the first time, vulnerable. The moment they were solid, the Tharessi vessels opened fire with their retrofitted kinetic batteries, and the percussion of it, the sound that traveled through hull plates and deck frames and the bodies of everyone who had spent their lives fighting in silence, shook the entire fleet like a drumbeat. They fell. Not all at once. Not without cost. 7 Felt broke through the perimeter and reached the outer Tharessi vessels before they could be intercepted, and 3 ships took damage and 4 people died, and David felt each of those deaths as the specific weight they were. But the line held. The combined fleet advanced. The kinetic fire was continuous and coordinated and utterly relentless, and the Felt, creatures that had fed on energy and grown fat on the most advanced weapons in the galaxy, discovered what it meant to meet a problem they could not consume. The battle lasted 3 hours and 11 minutes. When the last Felt dispersed, not defeated, not destroyed, but driven back through whatever seam in reality they had emerged from, the fleet fell silent. On 52 command decks, Soldiers who had learned in the past 5 weeks to hold a weapon they'd never trained with sat in the quiet and understood, slowly, that they were still alive. David Okafor stood at the observation port of Vanguard 7 and watched the Corvin rift settle back into its ordinary darkness. Beside him, Seva Marin stood close enough that the warmth of her presence was distinct. Not a comfort exactly, but something he had learned to rely on in the way you learn to rely on things that prove themselves constant. "You said you'd tell me the word," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said it, in Tharessi first, a word that sounded like something between resonance and recognition, 3 syllables that the translation matrix rendered imperfectly as, "the one who answers." "It means," she said carefully, "the person who shows up when all your answers have run out." A pause. "We use it rarely. We do not apply it lightly." She turned to look at him. "I am applying it to you." He held her gaze, all 4 of her eyes. The gold in them at this hour, with the starlight of the rift coming through the observation port, was something he did not have words for. Not because he lacked vocabulary, but because some things preceded language, existed in the space before you learned to name them. "The Tharessi High Command," she said, "will want to formalize what happened here.
Alliance Protocole.
Technology exchange. Military integration." A slight pause. "They will also want to know why a Tharessi general spent 38 days on a human station when she had access to her own vessel." "What will you tell them?" "That I was learning," she said. "That there were things worth knowing that I could only learn here." She did not look away. "That humanity taught me something my civilization forgot. That strength is not self-sufficiency. That the bravest thing you can do, sometimes the only brave thing, is to ask for help." Outside, the fleet was beginning its dispersal. 52 ships, 2 species, moving through the dark together for the first time in history. The station's power systems hummed at full capacity. The felt had fed on them, but feed in the wrong direction, and even disruption left something behind. David had a report to file, promotion board to navigate, a message to write to the families of the 4 people who hadn't come home. He would do all of those things, every one of them, but not yet. "Stay," he said, "long enough to see what comes next." She considered it. The golden threads beneath her skin glowed steadily, warmly, in a way he had learned to read. "Yes," she said, "I believe I will." In the dark of the Corvin rift, 41 Tharessi warships and 11 human vessels held position, waiting for orders that would shape the next decade of galactic history. Somewhere in a facility in Connecticut, workers who went home to their families every evening were already receiving the production orders that would arm those ships properly. Somewhere in the Tharessi inner systems, 11 billion people were still alive who had not known, this morning, how close the margin had been. And on a station at the edge of everything, a human commander and a Tharessi general stood at an observation port and watched the stars, and neither of them spoke because some things don't require words. The old methods had returned, not as a step backward, as a reminder that the universe respected simplicity, mass and velocity, and the stubborn refusal to accept that anything got to be untouchable were, in the end, the most advanced ideas anyone had ever had. Humanity had never stopped throwing rocks. And sometimes that was exactly what progress looked like. If the story moved you, if you felt the weight of those 11 billion lives, or the quiet in that observation port, subscribe and leave a comment telling us, what was the moment that got you? Because humanity's story is just beginning, and we don't want you to miss a single chapter.